Sorry about that brief glitch. Thanks a bunch for the invitation to speak here about some of our recent results. It's a great privilege to be talking at Quantum in Africa, even if remotely. I hope to be able to visit sometime in the future. It's a beautiful continent that I have not been to yet. And today I want to talk about kind of two separate, but you'll see how they're related results, which I'm particularly excited about. And part of it is a little bit philosophical and part of it is a little bit technical. And I hope to be able to bring it up to a level that makes everyone excited about this type of result and how it personally changed my view on parts of science and how I think about these kinds of things going forward. So when we think about quantum computing, we often think about, what's it going to be used for? What are its early application areas? And what's the benefit that it's going to give us in principle? And there's been a lot of attention paid to, as just a few examples, something like optimization. So maybe that's on continuous landscapes or discrete problems. And another application of interest, perhaps to many people here, is one of quantum simulation. So the use of a quantum computer to simulate another quantum system. And why do we want to use quantum computers for some of these problems is often things like a speed up that's going to be quite different than using something like a GPU or just many CPUs. We're really talking about looking for asymptotic speedups. And just to give people a flavor of what that means, in a lot of optimization problems, we think we can get something like a quadratic speedup, which for some example instance might be taking something like a year of computation time down to 2 weeks. But the more exciting one, and the one we think we might get for a lot of quantum simulation problems, is something like exponential speedups. And this is really something that takes, for an example I'm pulling from the literature, something we think might take 10 to the 82 years classically, down to something like 300 seconds. And to gauge yourself with some kind of barometer, current estimates of the age of the universe, according to Wikipedia, are something like 14 times 10 to the 9 years. So really what this means is we're hoping there are problems out there for which quantum computers can essentially make the impossible routine and really open up new areas and new exciting explorations of computation that we could not otherwise do without these devices. So I actually, for this part of the talk, am going to take a little bit of a different view than just to say that quantum computers are going to speed up everything if only we could get to them. I'm actually going to ask a little bit of a separate question, which is, say it takes us some amount of time to get to quantum, like real quantum computers that can do that kind of exponential speed up we would like. Have we been taught anything about basic science areas we're very interested in the meantime that we might not have noticed quite yet? And I want to talk specifically about what the foundations of computer science might teach us about chemistry and in large part chemical synthesis. And so I'm kind of going to flip the script, which is you often have this narrative that I'm caricaturing at the bottom when it comes to chemistry, that I digitize some molecule, I simulate it in a quantum computer, and out comes this solar punk utopia where things like solar energy and everything become easily accessible. And I'm going to say, okay, well, what if things are a little bit different than we might have imagined? And so when I say simulating chemistry, so I don't know how many chemists there are in the audience, but I'll just kind of say what I mean in this kind of restricted sense. There are, of course, many ways to simulate it. What we often mean when we talk about quantum computing is we're secretly or implicitly referring to electronic structure. And in this kind of problem, what we would like is be able to go from some loose idea of a molecular structure down to something like an understanding of this simply from first principles. So I might have gotten that structure from a guess that I made. I might have gotten it from some kind of diffraction experiment or other informed ways of getting the information. And just from that structure, I hope to gain some amount of understanding. For example, how it absorbs light, how it complexes with different species, or maybe how it interacts with some kind of metal surface or the like. And from that understanding, my hope is to take one more step and gain a new level of control. If I can understand why things absorb light the way they do, which functional groups cause that, maybe I can engineer better photovoltaics. If I know why different species complex with each other, perhaps I can do something like prevent the misfolding of proteins and inhibit disease and things like that. And if I really understand the interaction of different small molecules with surfaces and metals, then perhaps I can design new catalysts and get platinum out of catalytic converters and make more ecologically friendly motorways. But today I'm going to think a little bit about a separate question, just kind of a thought experiment, which is to say, how would one simulate chemistry if we didn't really have our past 100 years of chemistry knowledge that very good and very smart people have worked on for a long time? That is to say, imagine that we just have some pot of reagents. So these could be, base chemicals, ethanol, acetone, and I have a huge bath of them. And basically, I want to ask questions like, what products can I make? And I have some target that I'm going to try to reach. And I can ask questions about that target, like how long do these reactions typically take? Or does this ever happen? And so now I want to imagine that I'm in this weird situation. And I could imagine even that we have a classical chemical model that's good, or a quantum model of the wave function. But really, this dynamics is all I have. I know how the electrons interact with each other, or I know how the atoms and molecules tend to want to move around in this system. And now this is the only thing I have. I have these governing equations of motion, and I could ask, can this be used to answer these questions in a reasonable manner? And so if this is all I have, sometimes just one copy of it, for example, then I can basically put all my reagents in, and I can push things forward in time, and I can wait. And I can wait, and I can wait and wait. And then perhaps I never saw this reaction happen, but does that mean it never happened? And so this is, of course, not how we do chemistry. Basically, but you might imagine that quantum computers have made things, as I mentioned on a previous slide, much, much faster. So maybe we could do this on a quantum computer. So if I imagine my system just maybe protein with an excitation on it, and it has a Hamiltonian that governs it, one thing that quantum computers have been shown to be really good at is just stepping this object forward in time. And this is a rapidly developing field. Even for fairly complex chemical species, we believe we can get sort of numerically exact evolutions in a time that's sort of sublinear in the number of basis functions, meaning we can tightly control the error with reasonable cost overhead. And we believe for this type of problem, this generic quantum dynamics, exact classical competition hits a hard exponential wall. That is, doing it explicitly takes this exponential amount of time, like that 10 to the 82 years I talked about. And approximate methods are very hard to make work, at least to date, including tensor network methods where things like entanglement blow up in a way that's hard to control. And so you might think that I just told you that quantum computers exponentially speed up problems like this, but it turns out one of the things that we know from quantum computer science early on is that indeed that quantum computers are restricted by a sort of no fast forwarding theorem as well. And so if I grossly caricature what it says, that basically at any particular level of theory, so like some level of exactness that I might want, the simulation time is going to be greater than some constant times the physical time. And an easy way of seeing how this has to be true, if you maintain all of your accuracy, is if this weren't true, then you could simply use a system to simulate itself. And then you could sort of recurse on this and do basically any computation nearly instantaneously. And so if we're given this kind of bound, what does this tell us about this problem of doing chemistry without any knowledge of chemistry? Well, we know there are chemical reactions out there that even with a mole of reagent can take hours or days or weeks to appreciably occur. And if we have any kind of factor of C, which we often do, or we only have one realization, if we have such a chemical reaction that takes hours, we're essentially never going to get any useful information about it. And so this seems rather depressing. But of course, that's the dynamics problem. And often if you've watched some of these talks on quantum computing for electronic structure, you'll notice that that problem is often referred to a lot less, perhaps only as a subroutine, than this favorite tagline that gets used, which was this quote by Paul Dirac that said, "The underlying physical laws necessary for the mathematical theory, the part of physics and the whole of chemistry, are thus completely known, and the difficulty is only that the exact application of these laws lead to equations much too complicated to be soluble." Which is to say, we often think of mapping molecules or some digitization of them into this time-independent Schrodinger equation, for which we believe its stationary states or eigenstates give us good physical intuition about our systems. But really, what's happening here? So I went from a dynamics problem to a statics problem. when I told you that dynamics were what quantum computers were in fact quite good at. So why is this a useful perspective to switch into this stationary state point of view? And if you take kind of a quick glance at what, for example, you have in these two setups. So you have something where you're just looking at molecules moving around, and you have this kind of stationary picture. And in fact, in quantum complexity theory, we often think of the dynamics problem as it's defined as relatively easy, or BQP. And we think of ground state problems or particular eigenstate problems as quite hard, or QMA. So why do we tend toward this latter description so often? And one reason for this is, like I said, from this quantum no fast forwarding theorem, we know that this left-hand approach is limited to physical timescales. So if I want exact enough descriptions of my dynamics and I want to study things like chemical reactions, this might not ever get me any information that I care about. But we have other observations about the world, and this is kind of going to be a recurring theme as I get to data and learning later in this talk, which is what happened when we studied chemistry and physics over the last few hundred years, is that we looked outside and not every possibility that could ever happen was happening. We started to observe very real facets of our universe. And for example, we noticed that the world was not actively on fire, and that thermodynamics was often predictive of long time behavior. Or said in another way, thermodynamics, which is this T goes to infinity limit, is often predictive of a large time that I am actually interested in. And this allows us to, in some cases, make predictions on time scale that are much longer than if I just stepped the physical system forward in time. And so this is an example of a sort of intelligent scientist looking around in the world, making observations and sort of shortcutting reality based on the simplicity of certain things that we see. And so, of course, thermo can't be better for all systems. And this is in part due to this complexity theoretic separation. And that is to say, in worst cases, it's basically as hard to enumerate these states on the right than it is to do the dynamics to exponential times. And basically what we're using is that physical systems that we care about often have a lot more structure than a totally arbitrary system. And this allows us to make interesting and reasonable predictions much farther ahead than, say, these theorems would tell us. And so you can then ask yourself, well, what are the predictive powers of these kind of reduced quantities or free energies? And you ask yourself, well, if the no fast forwarding theorem holds, but I'd still like to do science, can all physically interesting questions be answered by some reduced model? And interestingly, quantum computer science and generally computer science have something to say about this as well, which there's been recently attempts to study problems like, does a system ever thermalize? That is, given some setup, and if I take it to infinite time, will it reach its thermal state? Does a particular system have an electronic gap? So if you define some unit cell and you tile it out to infinity, does that system at infinity have a gap? And a similar question might be, will molecule X ever form from constituents Y? And we've shown that these problems are actually undecidable. We in the royal sense, I haven't done that myself. And this concept of undecidability, you might have heard of in the concept of, or context of Turing's halting problem, but I'm going to borrow a more physical description for this audience, which is to say physical undecidability, borrowed from Chris Moore, is this idea that as a system evolves in time, there are sudden qualitative changes that cannot be predicted in any way except evolving forward in time and seeing if it happens. And no answer in finite time can indicate to you that it will never happen for some system. And this might be, say, a reaction or the emergence of some interesting object from a smaller one, like the emergence of cells from proteins and DNA and things like that. And so you might say, okay, well, these types of undecidable models typically require infinite systems. And the chemistry in this universe that I'm mostly interested in is finite. So why are you talking about this? And I'm going to use this quote by George Box, which is to say all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think this perspective of undecidability will allow us to have a useful perspective on ways to solve some of the hardest problems that we've faced so far in things like chemical synthesis. So to remind you, this synthesis problem is often, I'm given some set of reagents that I'm allowed to play with, and a number of reaction conditions and other tools I can use. And the question is, can I ever make this molecule on the right? Or perhaps how can I make this molecule on the right? And so there's one perspective, which is often taken in, say, computational screening studies, which is the best way to answer this question is from a sort of thermodynamic and combinatorial point of view. So I simply consider all possible arrangements of some set size of atoms. And if I can't do it, I go slightly bigger. And this, of course, scales exponentially as I increase my system size. And if I reach some finite size and run out of power, I might say, well, it's hard to make. Probably it can never be synthesized. But I'm going to suggest that perhaps a more realistic model, and one that is sort of perhaps not realistic, but useful, is this open model. So I have some set of reagents, and I can borrow from, rather than having a fixed number of atoms, from this giant reagent bath. And I'm going to argue that in this situation, rather than being defeatist, that data models or learning from existing systems in nature are especially powerful. And so essentially, you can imagine that this is kind of hard to do in the combinatorial case because we've seen situations where, say, we believe a reaction is somewhat impossible, and then some enormous biological protein or enzyme comes in and shows us that it can do this at room temperature and fairly benign conditions. And we never would have imagined that this enormous machine compared to the molecule would have been required to catalyze this reaction. And so it can be quite hard to conclude absolutely whether this will happen. And so in many cases, real systems have these features and side reactions and things like that, that I'm going to argue that the sort of open systems point of view makes a lot more sense. And you might say, well, where have we seen hints of this in other places? Which is to say, where are infinite models and sort of undecidable or unpredictable dynamics interesting? And I would argue that perhaps the first case that you see, it has a sort of special name, but we would like to say, you know, is there some reduced number that predicts the state of something like an Ising model? And one of the first things you learn about is spontaneous symmetry breaking. So if you did the thermodynamics alone, the all up and the all down direction with no magnetic field are equally likely. And until you go ahead and look at one spin or break that symmetry with an even slight fluctuation, can you see which system it goes into? But otherwise you can't know. And you might say, well, that's a rather mundane effect. But I would argue this is often amplified in something like spin glasses, where now your idea of thermodynamics is sort of very hard to make predictive in the traditional sense, because once you get trapped into one of these large wells within a spin glass, that sort of defines an almost local thermodynamics. And so this Gibbs measure is invented to patch up this fact that it can be very hard to predict exactly which of these many pure states you'll get in, and if you'll ever get out in any reasonable time scale. And so you say, well, this all sounds a little bit defeatist. You're telling me that there are some problems for which rote computation will be very hard, and problems for which I'm not going to be able to take some small chunk of my system, do a calculation, and make a prediction about a large chunk of my system. But what I'm going to argue is that there's this concept known as advice in computer science. And we know that undecidability can formally be broken by advice in some cases. And my argument is also that data from our real world is going to be a restricted form of advice. And we're able to lean on that for some of these hardest problems to do things that we couldn't otherwise do without this data. And so this kind of ties back now into this idea of how do we start to think about learning from data from our physical world? So we as scientists, I think, maybe take for granted that these observations and things like that have moved us along and made science possible. And that perhaps if we had just sat down and thought in isolation, sometimes we think we could reach the same conclusions. But I'm going to argue that some of this work intimately relies on the fact that we can look around in our world and see things. So often in quantum computing, we think about computationally limited problems. So these are problems like factoring or simulating a Hamiltonian that have relatively simple inputs. We know what we want to ask about the output. And there is a known computational procedure on a classical computer. It's just very, very expensive. And so in a best case, we might imagine that the compute on a quantum computer takes something like a linear cost in the input size, while the classical computer takes exponential time. But there are separate kinds of problems. So there's sometimes, data problems or communication problems or query problems where you're limited by the availability of data. And actually, no amount of computation is possible to overcome this lack of data. And so this is the kind of problem we're going to lean on today. And so you might imagine this is sort of limited experimental measurements from a system or a limited number of copies of some state that someone gives to you with your quantum computer and what you can do to it. And this might come from something like a transduced quantum state or another analog quantum simulation or another system like that. And one of the reasons we've become very interested in this type of problem is we recently ran into this issue of what we found kind of the intersection or just outside of these, which were data-assisted problems. So you have some problem, which you can prove is in this computationally limited problem class, but at the same time, if I hand you only a small number of examples, it suddenly becomes easy for a classical computer with sort of a learning algorithm to perform on that task. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that class and then how it motivates our work in the data limited problems case. So what's a very simple caricatured motivating example for these data limited problems? So if I have some quantum circuit, and you can just imagine this as a very interesting quantum system that does a bunch of manipulations to another system. And I have some input that I encode as an amplitude, and say this is a relatively small number of amplitudes that I'm going to encode, but it lives in a very large Hilbert space. So I'm just going to use P of 2 to the n amplitudes here. And my task will be to compute the output of some function defined by this circuit and some observable. And I'm going to allow that circuit to be arbitrary length. So this could be an exponential time computation. And so we know that direct simulation of this is as hard as BQP or much, much harder. And so you might look at this and say, well, this probably is a very powerful function of the inputs. This might make for a great model of some function or some great machine learning system. And I'm going to change the problem, though, and give my problem a little bit of data as a treat. That is some examples for which I'm going to tell you what the answer is ahead of time. And you're going to have access to this small data subset. And so now I'm going to kind of rewrite this problem in a particular way. So remember that P is relatively small. I'm just going to kind of rearrange terms and lump a lot of the complexity into this matrix B. So B is defined by an exponential length quantum circuit. And this kind of is a different form of how you might imagine it. But what I can see after giving it this data and kind of rewriting the problem this way, even though the entries of B are defined in a very complicated way, you can kind of glance at this and realize it's at most a quadratic function of entries of xi with p squared coefficients. And so we sort of know from learning theory that I need about p squared over epsilon squared data points to guarantee myself that I could predict this matrix B and then give you the answer for any other arbitrary input that I wanted quite easily. And so the punchline of this is that with no data, so just an arbitrary quantum circuit, which could have been Shor's factoring algorithm, could have been something even more wild. This was a hard quantum circuit, and we believe it's exponentially hard to compute on a classical computer. But when I gave you just a quadratic amount of data points, it became an almost trivial learning task for which if I just had a few answers from the quantum computer, I never need to use the quantum computer again. And so this is a bit of a caricatured problem in the sense that the amplitude coding is, you might argue, is not great, or the size of the data input is not so favorable. But it was motivation for us to kind of look to see where are other problems that are like this. Do you actually need a quantum computer in all cases for hard quantum problems? And this motivated us in this paper, The Power of Data in Quantum Machine Learning, to more formally define a complexity class for which if you have access to data, so be this from a quantum computer or from your physical world that resulted from a quantum process, you are actually provably in a complexity class where you can solve some of the problems of BQP with just efficient classical compute and those samples. And in fact, there may be other problems outside of that you can solve as well. And so what kinds of problems are learnable from data apart from that toy problem? So this was worked on as a follow-up by some of our co-authors. And they showed that, perhaps interestingly to people here, that there are many ground state problems for which if you just collect a few data points in each phase, then for any other parameters in my Hamiltonian, I can give you characteristics of the ground state relatively easily. And so you start to look at this as someone who studies physical systems with quantum computers, and you ask yourself, well, is the fate of quantum computers just to provide training data for classical models? And you say, well, that seems like actually a very practical and interesting use if material design is my game. But for one of the world's most advanced technologies that a lot of people are working on today, that seems like a somewhat depressing outcome or fate. So that brings us kind of to the purpose of this next experiment that we worked on, and theory and experiment, which was to narrow down on problems where the quantum computer was sort of essential to extracting that data. So the quantum computer doesn't just provide this training data or database, but rather it is essential in the collection of data from our physical world. So I'm going to imagine a scenario of quantum enhanced experiments. That is, I'm going to come in and ask for some amount of data from my physical world. So this might be a quantum sensor with many qubits that I ask for copies of a state. Or it might be, say, another quantum simulation that I do where I want to work on part of that state and analyze it. And I'm going to imagine two scenarios, one in which I can do something that mimics experiments that we do today, which is to say arbitrary measurements on some system. But as I take those measurements, I always have to re-prepare the state. And I'm going to compare that to the top quantum enhanced scenario, where I'm allowed to keep at least one copy of that state around before asking for another sample from my quantum sensor, and then I'll be able to jointly analyze them. And so in this case, the top one, I'm going to imagine this as receiving new copies of my quantum state, doing some kind of arbitrary measurement and process, versus the classical case where I need to destructively measure at each individual step. And in both cases, eventually I'm going to do some processing and computation on the eventual results. And I'm similarly going to look at the case of physical processes where instead of just a state, I can prepare some probe, expose it to a process, and then look back at what I'd like to do. And what we're going to show in this work is that with exactly two copies on two different tasks in official classical compute, we can attain an exponential advantage in the top case for analyzing data from the physical world when compared to the bottom case. And a key part of this is we're going to try to make the tasks as simple as possible. So there had been work in the past kind of showing this for more complicated tasks, but we really wanted to know what is the essence of the quantum advantage here. So let me tell you a bit about the setup and the problem that we get the advantage on. So what I'm going to imagine is that I get n copies of some quantum state, and I'm going to allow everyone to know the form of this state that comes in. So identity plus alpha times some poly operator that's a long string of polys. And I think an important part of this state, so alpha and p are unknown despite the state being of this form and everyone knowing it, but the state is unentangled but not factorizable, and it can be realized in a depth one Clifford circuit. And this was interesting for us because we wanted to be able to show this advantage in a case as close to classical as possible due to data being sort of close to classical in the real world oftentimes. And if we could do that, we could maybe identify where the quantum components are that are leading to some of this advantage. And the task that we're going to consider is I'm going to give you n copies of this state row. You're allowed to take any measurements you want on these n copies, and then you have to stop. So you can either be in the first scenario where you're doing operations on single copies at a time, so you can do arbitrary quantum computation, but you have to measure, or the second case where you can keep at least one extra copy around. So I'm going to now collect some classical data signature that I put in a database from either case 1 or case 2. And now I'm going to give you a new poly operator O and say predict trace row O, or its magnitude. Or alternatively, I could give you two candidate operators and say which one of the two did I use in my state. And then I'll do this through many rounds and check how accurate you are on this system. And so it's probably worth mentioning, since you're going to see in a second that the quantum experiment is quite straightforward to some extent, where the bulk of the work here was. And really it was to show rigorously that this is sort of an information theoretic advantage. And if you go through this task, the sort of single copy case, so the best conventional strategy requires an exponential number of copies in order to reach the accuracy you want with the probability you want. And sort of the sketch of this proof is that if you simply consider a state distinguishing task between this state and sort of the totally mixed one, then you can sort of show that the optimal way you can measure this state can only give you so much information about it. And the quantum protocol, on the other hand, is relatively simple. You can simply start with 2 copies of this state row, and we've kind of written it suggestively to hide the details of implementation. Even though it's quite simple when we will emulate it in our experiment, we want to imagine this scenario where we receive data from the outside world and we don't know a lot of details about the state row. And now I'm simply going to perform these Bell measurements across the 2 systems and collect these 2 in bits. And this is going to kind of create a Bell sketch of my state that could be useful more generally in learning. But basically, the punchline of this story is that if you do it this way, there's a very simple scheme to go from these 2 in bits to the exact answer that you're looking at before that scales constant in the system size. And so to kind of summarize the scale of this particular separation, so the task is, again, I give you in copies of this state, you collect any data you want, and now I have a challenge task, which is I challenge you with this new operator O, and you tell me the trace row O to some specified error. And this classical case that only can take 1 copy at a time, but is actually quite powerful since it can do any quantum computation you want to it, takes 2 to the n copies. And this quantum enhanced scenario where you're allowed to leave some aspect of the first state behind before you couple it to the second can do this in constant time. And so what if we imagine Bell measurements as a feature in learning? That is to say, and oftentimes in quantum computation, we require very precisely tuned knowledge of the algorithm, and even slight errors can be amplified to make our procedure somewhat useless. But we would like the case to be that we don't need to know really the details of row or the exact prescription for how to do some of these tasks. And so what we're going to look at is, rather than just plug in the right answer, can I train at a small system size and extrapolate to a large system size using something like a neural network? And the reason we want to do this, despite knowing the answer, is, like I said, we want to imagine that we're in not such an easy scenario where we know the answer, but that we could still learn from this information and really discover something about the physical world. And we're going to show, so the right-hand side is not data for this experiment, but we will show that even these features are sometimes strong enough to do unsupervised learning. And I think it's important to put this in the context of broader quantum computation. So imagining and emulating a quantum data pipeline, I would say. And so you might say, well, where do you get this data from? And I think there's a lot of plausible sources like quantum computation or other analog simulations. And in the future, things like more natural quantum systems or advanced quantum sensors with multiple qubits that are entangled, and you try to say transduce them into the quantum system itself. And so transduction fidelities are low, and some of these are a little bit far off, but if we can motivate the development of that technology, we'll be pretty excited. But eventually, you're going to need some form of transduction, which might be the identity if your sensor is the same as your computer, but you'll put it into a quantum buffer. And then you're going to do some kind of interesting analysis. So the analysis I showed you before was quite simple, but I'll give an example later that's quite hard. And we imagine that we're then going to encode this into a logical encoding so that we can do advanced computation on it. And we're going to consider the logical encoding just part of the transduction fidelity. But essentially in this box, as far as we know right now, this will sort of always be unprotected from the point of view of precise quantum computation. Whereas this side with the quantum memory and quantum data processing, we imagine that we can predict after that encoding step, which will initially be non-fault tolerant, but we just take that to be some of our fidelity. And so this part is always unprotected. Then this is kind of an interesting test to run on a quantum computer, because proofs that we can do have some experimental flexibility, but not unlimited. And sort of the ultimate test of some of these is empirical. So can this work in a case where a lot of your pieces of this learning puzzle are somewhat noisy and somewhat unprotected? And so this sort of suggests that it's a natural place to put it on our quantum chip and say, how does this work in sort of an emulation of this experiment? So the big jump that we make is we pretend that we're closing our eyes and we don't know the circuit that makes rho, but rather that these states are being given to us and we can do this data processing on top of them. This is just sort of a cartoon at the right for this simple experiment of how we laid out the qubits for this particular problem on our architecture. And so now what experiments did we do on this? So we took this first task initially and we made it, I'm giving you n copies of rho. You can do any measurements that you want. And now I'm feeding this training data on small system sizes. So system sizes less than 8 or 16 physical qubits when we do 2 copies. And we see that it trains relatively well. And this is kind of the result that makes it quite compelling, is that you can sort of train both the classical and the quantum models. You can derive a lower bound, and then you sort of examine how well each of them are doing. And so as a function of the system size, we ask how many experimental rounds do you require to collect to reach some accuracy of, say, 70%. And we have a rigorous classical lower bound from the proofs. So any single copy measurements you do must require more than this amount of measurements. And then we actually did the computation for some of these classical cases to show you the gap between the lower bound and actual performance. And then this bottom line is actual data from our chip, which shows you that in the quantum case, so we went up to system sizes 20, so 40 physical qubits, you've gotten sometimes more than 4 orders of magnitude fewer experiments are required to learn to the same accuracy. And this is in a case where we did not give it the right answer. We just showed it a few examples on up to system size 8 and asked it how well it did at system size 20. So this kind of shows you that these features are robust enough that we didn't need to know the right answer ahead of time. And so you might say, well, those experiments were a little underwhelming. You could have done them with 2 qubits at a time if you relax this assumption that you didn't know enough about your state that was okay. How about a more interesting experiment that challenges sort of the limits of the device? And so to do that, we lean to this other task I mentioned about learning quantum processes. And for this task, we're going to say I have access to a quantum process n times, and I'm allowed to give it the probe state that I want. And I'm going to ask, was the probes or the process that happened random time reversal symmetric evolution? So you can think of that as like a random unitary, but only real entries, or a totally random unitary that has complex entries. And the protocol is going to look shockingly similar to before. I'm going to do a Bell prep, allow it to evolve under these systems, Bell measurement, and then I'm going to take again these 2n bit strings as a sort of Bell sketch. And this experiment's a little more complicated because we can't leave the layout the same. We have to kind of swap together to do these random unitaries and pull apart to do the Bell measurement and prep. So as a result, say the 2D dynamics that we did used 40 qubits, but now 1,300 gates with fairly substantial entanglement across the chip the entire time. And for me, this is kind of the big punchline result, is that this even enabled unsupervised discovery. So like I said, we often worry that quantum sort of computing requires us to have a very precise algorithm and to know a lot about the best way to do something ahead of time. Because if we make only slight errors, kind of the catastrophic phase cancellation doesn't work out. But in this case, we're just going to take those 2n bit strings that I got out, or n in the case of the classical ones, and I'm going to turn these into a feature in a fairly simple way. I'm going to do, say, 500 or 1,000 repetitions. I'm going to take the average and the variance of these, and it's going to be 2 numbers for each individual thing. I'm going to create a feature vector for each process. So just like this list of averages for each bit string and their variances. And then I'm going to use a very simple object from machine learning that creates a similarity between these two. So just this squared exponential kernel, and plug it into one of the simplest unsupervised machine learning algorithms that exist. And if I do this on single copies, and this blue is my generic case, and the red is this all real case, then if I looked at this data, I would conclude that they're probably about the same. There doesn't seem to be anything unique going on between the two. I don't know how I would separate these classes. It looks like one blob. But shockingly, if I feed in this same unsupervised discovery algorithm the quantum enhanced data, they very cleanly pull apart for both cases. So to me, this is exciting because it means if you were examining data from the real world and just plugging it into an unsupervised algorithm, the signal from these quantum measurements is so strong that you would immediately say there are definitely 2 distinct processes here. And now I can dive down on examples from one or the other and try to learn more. So it can really guide discovery in the real world. So kind of bringing this to my summary and outlook, I think my punchline for today is if we could find a suitable data source, our cloud computing devices today allow us to learn things that are otherwise inaccessible. And remember that these are data advantages rather than computational advantages. So actually no amount of classical supercompute could compete with anything I just said under the conditions of this data source that we have to find. And so what we had in this paper that I didn't talk, some of which I didn't talk too much about, was proofs of advantage in state learning, process learning, and quantum PCA, and experimental demonstrations of these state and process learning up to 40 qubits and 1,300 gates. And what the outlook is here is that I hope this inspires work on quantum data sources and sensors that tells us that the advantages once processed with a quantum device can in fact be far beyond quadratic, so long as you change this, the problem you're looking at to a more interesting learning task. I hope to find deeper connections to physics and interferometry experiments than we have so far, and perhaps go beyond these Bell features that seem to universally, in this case, be the right answer. And I hope these proof techniques can perhaps tell us something about existing learning tasks or quantum techniques. That I'd just like to thank all the authors, especially Robert Huang that did a bulk of the heavy technical work here, Michael Broughton for implementing our simulations and helping us scale up, and Brooks for our experimental implementations. Of course, all of the Quantum AI team and everyone here for listening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for a great talk. Very exciting developments there. So let me look at the chat. I think for the moment, people might be just typing. When you look at the issue of no data, hard quantum circuit with data, almost trivial learning task. With data, it sounds like assisted is like supervised machine learning, no? So in a certain way, this data-assisted machine learning, isn't it like a modified form of supervised machine learning?
Yeah, definitely. So those cases where I was talking about strongly data-assisted problems, this is definitely a supervised learning setup where, you're just kind of changing what you imagine the data source to be. And so if you have data that comes from a quantum process that you think is hard to simulate, this is somehow now a supervised learning problem for which the data is hard to generate, but now the prediction and learning task is quite easy. And so this was kind of the difference between, you might say, well, why was it hard to show this same type of advantage in just a traditional machine learning context? And the problem is that, if your data generation is also believed to be classical, then you can't really have a complexity separation in the sense of exponential separation, because you imagine that generating the data is only polynomially harder than learning from the data. And so you're left in the lurch by the definition of complexity classes. But here, if you assume the data generation can come from a hard quantum process, now you can imagine this new complexity class that leverages that in a supervised learning setting, as you said. Yeah.
Many years ago, when people looking at the data of the planets, they were finding complicated to model. So they had like a sphere within a sphere within a sphere, until Kepler was looking at it, and he came out with these 3 Kepler laws. So if the data from a planet were to be seen by your program, could your program get the Kepler laws? Let's say first Kepler law that the planets are moving into ellipses. Second, that the sun is in one of the 2 centers of the ellipse. And 3, the area law. So it has to do with the rate of spanning. So just by looking at the data, could your program rederive Kepler's law, number 1, number 2, could rederive, let's say, Newton's law, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the machine learning we used here was relatively simple in the sense that it was, fairly basic methods for sort of predicting almost numerical, I'd call it generalized interpolation to some extent. Maybe that's an unfair characterization. There has been work in the classical machine learning literature for learning conservation laws and physical principles from data. And it's a much more challenging question, because I think a lot of what we value in models is hard to distill so far, maybe we'll make progress on that, into what we want from the machine learning model. So for example, we might take that data and there might be, many equations or predictive models compatible with that data, but it's hard to capture for a machine, like what are the ones we consider most valuable. So we often would consider that a simplest model, so kind of like an Occam's razor, or often implicitly a causal model. So like elements of a simple physics model for which if we pushed on a parameter, it would actually cause the output we think, not just that they're arbitrarily correlated. And I think that work is exciting and people are trying to make headway. But a lot of machine learning algorithms would struggle, I think, if you just gave them the data from, say, the planets to spit out just Kepler's law. There might be some that have it in there if they're doing quite well, but then a human would say, well, what are these other 100 relationships between the data it spat out, and why do we exclude them while we're interested in this one?
I see. Yeah, the example I gave would be more suitable for classical machine learning, you're right. But if it were to be, let's say, a quantum experiment like the two-slit experiment, or some other truly quantum experiment, and then when the data is accumulated, then the algorithm will learn the underlying quantum dynamics. So therefore, you wouldn't have to. So in that case, we'll be learning from the quantum experiments and rederive some of the underlying equations or theoretical models from it. I see. Have you looked at some quantum experiments and then rederive, let's say, so if you have, let's say, feed some data consistent with Schrodinger equation, you rederive Schrodinger equation, but it's a certain data that needs to be modeled with the Dirac equation or the Klein-Gordon equation, no? Will the software you have learn from these experiments? Oh, in one case is using Klein-Gordon equation, another case using Dirac equation, another case using Schrodinger equation. Is it something feasible, or is it just not the right kind of things you're looking now? Or?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Those kinds of, say, classification or predictive questions are a little bit different than the ones we're asking. But I do imagine that if you had, say, data in the sense of examples of quantum evolution from, say, different governing equations like Dirac or Klein-Gordon or Schrodinger, you might be able to have sort of a classification process that tells you which of the three dynamics it was being governed by. But this would be a little bit easier of a task, I think, than say you're just given data but no inclination as, like, from one of these trajectories, could you derive, say, the equations of motion from it or a predictive model of it? I think would be much harder than just saying which of these three classes did the evolution come from and are they distinct?
I see. Then I'll send you later on. We have done some work on quantum tomography because it's a challenging problem to do. And then we're asking the question, how can machine learning provide help on quantum tomography? I'll send it to you to see. Probably your algorithm can do much better, so it'll be fine. But
yeah, there's some interesting kind of machine learning crossover with, it's not tomography, but we leaned on results like that here, which is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this sort of pack learnability of quantum states and sort of related shadow tomography type results, which considers a task that's easier than tomography. So it's tomography, you often force yourself to be quite accurate in either the process matrix or the density matrix. And to do so in the exact case has very high requirements. But if you ask yourself an easier question, which is, I want to get almost every observable right, and I'm willing to get a few of them wrong with some small probability, then in fact, the requirements in data are provably like linear in the number of qubits. It's like very surprising to me that if you allow small amounts of error and that's how you define your problem, suddenly it becomes much easier. And I think Scott Aronson did some of the early work on this, and there's been a lot of great follow-ups on this like learnability model of quantum states.
Great. There's a question online from Ismail Akalu Iyawa. Great talk. Why do you say dynamic simulation, even with no fast forwarding, is less likely to be useful? So why do you say dynamic simulation is less likely to be useful, even with no fast forwarding? And for example, docking small molecules over nanoseconds should be useful? Question mark. I don't understand the question, but do you want me to repeat it or?
I think I understand what he's asking.
Okay.
So I guess I wouldn't say that dynamic simulation is necessarily always less useful. It kind of depends on the question that you're asking. So if the thing you are interested in is really a dynamic process and is not sort of like a rare event that you're waiting for. So say, for example, you're already mostly set up for what you're looking for, and you just need to see the details of how things evolve or the exact time scale over which they evolve, then that's likely to be the best approach. What I was focusing in on is often we might think that the most natural way to simulate a system is dynamics. But for example, given even a small transition state, this process might become a rare event. And so if you don't use any other technology, so like rare event sampling or transition states, then you might need to simulate for an inordinate amount of time. And so if you think about what transition state theory says, you're really now doing also the thermodynamics of this transition state approximately. And we're using that to kind of fast forward or infer a most likely path. And for those types of problems, it would be incredibly difficult, I think, to do it directly as dynamic simulation. That's not to say it's less useful in other cases where you know this process is going to happen relatively quickly. And even for docking, I would say, like, there are nanoseconds could be an eternity for a quantum computer where the time step is more like femtoseconds. But even apart from that, those docking approaches sometimes use clever schemes for which to try different trial configurations or have screening methods that can work even beyond just straight dynamics or doing some things in the background that help them out.
A question here, we have two more questions. We can just go perhaps quickly. Assuming we evolve, I know there's another one. Amazing work. Isn't the first work you presented a breakthrough for classical machine learning? Question mark. Isn't it the first proof that classical learning from data is better than classical modeling? Maybe this is one reason why deep learning is so powerful. Yeah. Do you want me to repeat the questions or?
No, I have them open, so it's easier to read them as well.
Okay, so you can read it.
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think it honestly, this result changed my perspective on how learning, both in like a deep learning context, but also learning in a more human way. So like as a scientist, where we look at observations to drive our endeavors, was in some ways a much more powerful model of working than just sort of rote computation, if you want to call it that. And I think the big challenge, I'm not sure if what the closest proofs are in classical ML that show this advantage. Kind of like I was saying before, the thing that allowed us to show a complexity theoretic separation was that we can try to lean on this idea that the quantum data actually is generated by a process that would take exponential compute to do classically. The problem with the purely classical paradigm is that if it came from a classical process, then we assume that that is, in a computer science definition, all parts of this are efficient if then the learning is efficient. But efficient is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. We would still consider them in the same class if, say, learning from data was linear time and modeling it directly, cost you system size to the 47th power. So this is kind of a deficiency in practicality of the definition of complexity classes. But I think it's a result that people in classical machine learning should be interested to embrace and see if one can kind of explore this paradigm, not in complexity theory, but to say, make assumptions about the cost of generating data versus learning from it. And I think this is one of the reasons why machine learning and science are so powerful generally, and it's deep learning can be quite powerful for similar reasons.
So therefore, it's, let me see, there's another question here. assuming we evolve to a time where we have workable quantum computers, do you foresee a situation where we will have classical data that were good for classical computers being unusable? That's a unusual question here, but go ahead.
Let's see. So assuming we evolve to a time, do we foresee a situation where we would have classical data that were good for classical computer been unusable? So I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but perhaps you're asking, is there a situation in which we would no longer need or want classical computers if we have quantum ones? And if that's your question, I guess my answer would be probably not, only from like an economics perspective. So the scale and cost and speed in which we can make classical computers is so advanced that it would take, there are so many tasks for which we don't believe there's an overwhelming advantage for a quantum computer, that it's likely we will always want powerful classical computers around to do these sort of more mundane or very useful tasks still, just because they're so well developed and that technology is much easier to access and likely easier to deploy and scale as far as we know.
If not, because he told me he might have a meeting. So let's thank the speaker for a great talk with very exciting results that I need to study this more carefully because it looks very, very, very interesting. So it's exciting. And so it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you for your beautiful overview. And this has been an eye-opening presentation. Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.